Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you to all of you who've joining us today from across the globe. My name is Ray Offenheiser, and I'm the director of the Pulte Institute of Global Development here at the University of Notre Dame. As an integral part of Notre Dame's Keough School for Global Affairs, the Pulte Institute seeks to address global poverty and inequality through policy, practice, and partnership. Our team designs, implements, monitors, and evaluates development projects and programs to promote human dignity and empower the world's poorest and most vulnerable populations. We're pleased to be hosting today's webinar. In June 2015, leaders from government, business, and civil society gathered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to discuss the financing of the Sustainable Development Goals. In this meeting, leaders acknowledged that aid funding alone was insufficient to achieve the goals, and that governments and the private sector would have to step up. Governments through more aggressive domestic resource mobilization, and business through increasing strategic engagement and investment. Many companies were already embracing the SDGs, increasing their investments in emerging markets, and exploring new forms of engagement and partnership through initiatives of the World Economic Forum, the Global Compact, the New Alliance on Agricultural Nutrition in Africa, and others. Others were exploring ways to leverage the supply chains, or their supply chains, to add social value through technological, financial, or entrepreneurial innovation. USAID has been encouraging such collaboration for the last 30 years through a variety of different initiatives at both the global and mission level. Our panel today represents an effort by USAID and colleagues at the Pulte Institute at Notre Dame to take stock of this progress. Today, we are joined by our friends from USAID to present a new tool we have been working on as part of the Laser Pulse Consortium. The tool is called the Private Sector Engagement Evidence Gap Map. Created in alliance with USAID's Private Sector Engagement Evidence and Learning Plan, the panel will present an interactive visual tool that allows users to explore the evidence of private sector engagement by region, by country, technical sector, industry, type of enterprise, and type of document. Rather than being a static one-off audit of what evidence exists, it's a living resource that will be continuously updated with the latest evidence on private sector engagement. Our goal today will be to accomplish three things: provide background on evidence building for private sector engagement and how it contributes to USAID's Self-Reliance learning agenda, present an interactive demonstration of the tool, including a live case study from USAID implementing partner on measuring Impact 2 programs, and offer opportunities to collaborate with the team to help fill evidence gaps. On behalf of the Pulte Institute, it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speakers. Kathy Roskowski is Evidence and Learning Lead on USAID's Private Sector Engagement Team. Paul Perrin is Director of Evidence and Learning here at the University of Notre Dame's Pulte Institute, and Gita Yule is Senior Associate with Environmental Incentives. Kathy, Paul, and Gita will take us through the new tool and how it can be a benefit to those of you who may be engaging with the private sector in your development work. Without further ado, I'll now hand it over to Kathy to get us started. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ray. It's really nice to be here today, and I'm excited to share with you this evidence gap map. Paul, if you can advance the slide, we can show the agenda. So the agenda for today's webinar is to share background on evidence building for private sector engagement, or PSE, introduce the private sector engagement evidence gap map, demonstrate the private sector engagement evidence gap map, including thoughts from an implementing partner's perspective, and discuss opportunities to help fill the gaps. We will be sure to leave plenty of time for Q&A as well. Next slide, Paul. Thanks. USAID is undertaking a major cultural and operational transformation to expand private sector engagement agency-wide. Through its private sector engagement policy, which was launched in December of 2018, USAID has issued an agency-wide call to action and mandate to work hand in hand with the private sector to design and deliver our development and humanitarian programs in all sectors. Private sector engagement, or PSE, is a strategic approach to international development through which USAID consults, strategizes, aligns, collaborates, and implements with the private sector for greater scale, sustainability, and effectiveness of development and humanitarian outcomes. Next slide. This policy signals for USAID an intentional shift to pursue market-based approaches and investment as a means to accelerate a country's progress on the journey to self-reliance. On this basis, the policy calls for USAID and our partners to ask and address the following questions every time we approach a development or humanitarian issue. Can the private sector solve this problem by itself? Could there be a market-based approach to addressing this challenge? What are the roles and interests of the private sector in addressing this challenge? Are there factors constraining the private sector from involvement and investment? And is there a role for USAID to help alleviate or eliminate these constraints? By asking these questions in this order, USAID will focus on seeking more sustainable, enterprise-driven outcomes from the outset of our planning and programming. Next slide. To integrate PSC effectively into our operating model, the policy highlights 4 operational principles. You can see here that building and acting on evidence of what works and what does not in private sector engagement is an operational principle of the PSC policy and a commitment of USAID. Next slide. To that end, USAID has established a private sector engagement evidence and learning plan. It serves as a guide for activities that will strengthen and improve the use of evidence in decision-making on private sector engagement approaches. At its core, this plan is a coordinated effort to identify and fill critical knowledge gaps and to disseminate that evidence across the agency. The development of this plan was finalized in May of 2019, and it sets out key learning questions for the agency to better understand what works and what does not in PSC. Next slide. The efforts of this PSC evidence and learning plan support the agency's broader learning agenda, or the Self-Reliance learning agenda, known as SRLA. SRLA is how USAID will ensure what we're learning as we go in operationalizing the agency's priority of fostering self-reliance. It's both a process and a set of products that together help us gather and make sense of evidence around how countries move towards self-reliance and how USAID can best support them on that journey. The focus of the Self-Reliance Learning Agenda is on facilitating utilization of evidence to inform and improve USAID's and our partners' efforts to foster self-reliance. It includes 13 learning questions. Question 4 focuses on evidence building for private sector engagement and aligns with the agency's private sector engagement evidence and learning plan. Recently, USAID's Policy Planning and Learning Bureau conducted an analysis to identify synergies between illustrative learning questions that were submitted by missions as part of their country development cooperation strategy process and the self-reliance learning questions. This graphic here shows that there is significant demand and interest in evidence and learning with respect to question 4 on private sector engagement in our field missions, as many of them have identified a learning question related to private sector engagement. Next slide. As one of the products of the agency's private sector engagement evidence and learning plan and the Self-Reliance Learning Agenda, we hope that the private sector engagement evidence gap map will facilitate the use of evidence in private sector engagement approaches and help target evidence building efforts to fill the knowledge gaps that remain. The tool consolidates what is known and unknown about PSC via a thorough literature review, internal and external for the last 10 years, highlighting gaps. The private sector engagement evidence gap map will serve as a regularly updated PSC evidence repository. Our call to action to our agency colleagues and to our implementers is to use evidence when you engage the private sector. To explain how it was built, I will turn it over to Paul. Paul led the development of this tool, and now he will describe how it was developed and then share his screen to provide a demonstration.
Greetings, everyone. We are glad that you were able to join us today. And I'm excited to be able to show you what we've been working on alongside our USAID colleagues today. We live in the information age. I was recently reminded of this when one of my children asked me what a water tower was used for, and I actually had no idea. And if this question had come to me 15 years ago, I would have had to remember the question, go to the library, search the library, find a book, and come up with the book. But as it was, because we live in this age, I was able to Google the question, find answers, multiple different answers, along with graphics and all kinds of different sources of knowledge. And because we live in the information age, it would seem that using evidence for decision-making should be easy, should be straightforward, self-evident. However, in practice, this is not always the case. In the case of private sector engagement, along with other operational areas, one of the challenges to applying evidence is the almost overwhelming amount of information that is out there, and the dearth of information in other areas. The purpose of the evidence gap map is to provide a structure for making sense of the body of evidence that surrounds the idea of private sector engagement. It allows the users to distill the evidence base to that evidence corpus that is most relevant and actionable for the type of situation or question that the user has. It also helps to identify areas for future evidence generation. The evidence gap map could just as easily be called an evidence map, meaning that it's a visual representation of the evidence that exists using a matrix built upon USAID's conceptualization of private sector engagement means and value propositions that both the private sector and development actors offer. We hope that by compiling this evidence into one place with a number of filter and search features, we can help facilitate the use of evidence. As you will see in just a moment, the evidence base can be filtered by geography, by sector, by industry, by private sector type, and document type. And it also includes a search function to allow search terms in the key findings, recommendations, title, partner, and publishing institution. So how did we build this? Well, we had a team at the University of Notre Dame, and we collaborated quite closely with USAID throughout this process to compile a repository of the private sector engagement evidence, beginning with USAID documentation, but expanding from that. We did literature search. We also searched the Development Exchange Clearinghouse that USAID maintains based on known activities that used and included private sector engagement activities. We did searches of external databases and repositories. And currently we have just around 600 items that are included in the evidence gap map. And as Kathy said, we hope to continue to grow that as we come across more evidence, including those that you might know of and wish to submit to us. All the documents that were included in the acceptable evidence types were reviewed and tagged with metadata, meaning that we added to all of the evidence elements that contain information about the geography, the technical sector, the private sector industry that was involved, and then the core of the matrix, which is the way that USAID engages and development actors engage, and the private sector value proposition. Each piece of evidence was reviewed by more than one reviewer so that we could ensure that the tagging was consistent and not in the mind of a single reviewer. Any differences between reviewers were subsequently discussed and harmonized. Next, we worked with our IT department at the university to develop a visualization tool that would allow users to interact with the information corpus. This visualization tool pulls from the backend database that we compiled surrounding the evidence. So now I would like to show you the actual tool. This is the evidence gap map tool that is available to anyone who wishes to access it. To begin, I wanted to highlight the different elements of the landing page so that you can make sense about how to start distilling the information corpus to that which is meaningful to you. So other than the title, which is at the top, there are three main components to the landing page. This first region here contains the ability to sift through the information. So you have filters here, and I'll show you this functionality. You can view the information corpus in a map format or in a list format. And then you have a search bar here that will allow you to search for key search terms. And these are all interoperational. So you can apply filters as well as search terms, and that it will all be additive. This next section here is the actual matrix, and you can see throughout different hover boxes here that will allow you to access additional information about what each of these elements of the matrix entail. So you can use this at your leisure, and the language from this comes directly from the Usaid policy. The ways we engage are also from the Usaid private sector engagement policy. We use that as the structure, as well as the private sector value propositions and the development actor value propositions across the top. The numbers in each of the boxes are where the items of evidence are contained within the evidence gap map. So if you click on each of the boxes, it will show you the relevant documents that sit at the intersection of each of the rows and columns of the matrix. So let me demonstrate to you how to use the filters. So if I were to say I'm interested in evidence in Asia, I would add that filter, and you can see that it updates the matrix in real time. Let's say I'm interested in democracy, human governance, and health. So you can apply multiple filters, and they're additive, as I mentioned before. So this then does both health and democracy and human governance. I might be interested in, if I'm interested in the health, let's say I'm interested in the healthcare, private sector industry, maybe food and beverage. And this then, I have distilled my corpus into points of evidence that are of interest to me. I can switch again between map and list view. Let's say I'm interested in this performance evaluation report. So each document in the evidence gap map has a document landing page. The document landing page includes some of the bibliographic information at the top. It also includes all the metadata tags that have been added to this document. And it includes key findings and, where appropriate, key recommendations. And most importantly for you, I suspect, would be the ability to actually view the document if you click on the document link. So each document landing page includes this basic set of information. And you can see I can get to the actual document that I am interested in viewing and read through that as desired. So I'm going to reset the filters here and show you the search functionality. I'll put this on list view now. You can, with the search functionality, also add filters. So I'm going to add a Middle East, and let's say I'm interested in Africa. And let's say, ironically, I'm Googling for any partnerships that include Google. And so you see that there are 4 documents within those filters that contain Google. So I might be interested in this workforce development and youth employment document that is a Usaid document, and go to that particular aspect. I would encourage all of you to play with this and find documents that are of interest to you. But also, we'd like to encourage you to understand this bottom part. So we are serious about opening up this repository to your contributions and your knowledge. We know that each and every one of you has information and knowledge that is important. And we would like to encourage you to contribute to the evidence gap map. And to this end, we have created a form that you can access at the bottom of the page by clicking on this form, and it will take you to this contribute a resource Google form. This will then submit it to us and we will receive a notification, but we would ask that you submit as much information on this form as possible so that we can then follow up with you about including your resource or resources within the evidence gap map. And this will allow us to maintain this as a living resource that continues to grow as we receive information. And so that is a brief overview of the evidence gap map as a tool. And I would now like to turn it back over to Kathy for the next section of the presentation.
Thank you, Paul, for that demo. As an example of how you might use the evidence gap map, we have invited Gita Uhl, Senior Associate at Environmental Incentives, to talk about how Environmental Incentives has been using the tool and how other implementing partners might use it. At Usaid, we held an internal webinar where we focused on mission technical staff as a use case. Today, we are excited to explore how this tool might be used by implementers. Welcome, Gita, and thank you for joining the conversation and for being a strong advocate for evidence-based private sector engagement. I know that you've already tested the tool quite a bit as part of your work with USAID's Latin America and Caribbean Bureau. We would love to hear your initial reactions.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, Paul. So at Environmental Incentives, we implement a number of USAID activities, including the Measuring Impact 2 activity that's managed out of USAID's Office of Forestry and Biodiversity. And as part of that work, we've been supporting the Latin America and Caribbean Bureau to develop a learning program that's focused on private sector engagement, specifically in the environment sector. And our initial consultations with environment officers in this region really showed us that identifying evidence and resources on private sector engagement was a top priority for them as they're looking to engage with the private sector more and more to achieve their own environment objectives. So what we're trying to do is better understand when, why, and how to best engage with the private sector to achieve better environment and development outcomes. And so we'll be developing and sharing resources to support USAID and partners who might be interested in applying this within their own work. So our team has recently been in the information gathering phase, and we wanted to better understand the agency framework around evidence and learning around private sector engagement and how existing resources and tools could be applied in the LAC environment context.
That's great. Can you tell us a bit more about how you use this tool to inform your work?
Sure. So since we were supporting a learning agenda that was essentially focused on building and sharing evidence around engaging the private sector, the timing of the tool was really great for us. So we reviewed the evidence gap map to see what we could learn from existing evidence out there and where there might be gaps. So one of the first things that we did was filter for Latin America, Caribbean region, and the environment sector.
Great, Gita. Paul, can we ask you to show the evidence gap map and filter for Latin America and Caribbean as a region and environment technical sector? Thanks. Gita, does anything stand out to you here?
Yeah, I think for us, it was great to just be able to visually see where there might be some existing knowledge or resources and where additional investments could, especially in our learning program, might be useful to further build out this evidence base. So we saw some gaps in evidence in engaging the private sector to strengthen the enabling environment and tap into their ability to influence policy and bring their innovation expertise and capabilities.
Great. Paul, can we look at the list view for this same filters, for these same filters?
So one, I guess this also just really reinforced for us what we had found in our own previous information gathering, which was that there's a lot of opportunity to support building and sharing evidence in this sector in Latin America and the Caribbean, especially when we were looking more specifically at biodiversity and sustainable landscapes programs, which is what our learning program is focused on. So after this, we did then filter for environment alone to see if there were any resources that could be applied from other regions.
Okay, let's see what happens when we reset the evidence gap map and filter for environment. What did you learn from when you applied this filter?
Yeah, so we noticed that there were a lot more resources for environment globally. I see a lot of resources for engaging the private sector to share information, align strategically, and catalyze private sector resources to tap into their ability to help USAID achieve scale, sustainability, and broader reach. So we would definitely want to explore those resources further.
Yes, we definitely wanted to create that visual of the ways we engage across meeting with the private sector value proposition as well as the development actor proposition, so that you can identify the intersections between engagement and potential value. Once you make a selection of a bubble or a circle, so let's select information sharing and strategic alignment and scale, sustainability, and reach as the value proposition, as you mentioned. The resources are sorted by the resource type. So you can click on anything interesting from here as well. Let's reset the filters. What else did you explore, Geeta?
So there's a lot of interest in environment sector and partnering with agribusiness to promote more sustainable agriculture and livestock practices. So we were curious to see if there might be any lessons learned from efforts to partner with these types of companies. So we thought it would be useful to look at the agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting industries in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Great, let's try that. So let's reset the filters and then filter for agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting industries in private sector industry, as well as LAC as the region, Latin American and Caribbean. What was useful to you here?
Yeah, we saw some great resources included here that I think would be relevant for our learning work. Saw some evaluations and case studies, especially on engaging the private sector for cocoa and coffee value chains. I would be curious to see if there's any resources related to sustainable livestock production, because I know that's of interest in the region as well.
Great, so actually with the search functions, you can search for livestock specifically. So let's reset the filters. As a reminder to everyone attending, the search feature searches key findings, recommendations, title, partner, and publishing institution of all the evidence in the repository. So we can search here for livestock. And let's see the list view for this. Thanks. Geeta, is there anything here that looks relevant to you?
Yeah, I do see some resources here that might be relevant, especially the case study on using digital tools to expand access to agricultural insurance.
Let's select that tool. So when you select the resource, again, you can see the key information for that specific piece of evidence, including the title, author, publication year, key findings, and key recommendations. You can also see along the right side the other tags for the same document, so you can know where it's cross-listed in the evidence gap map and what else you might be able to find within the resource. If you click on the link at the top right, you can also access the full resource and view it. Do any of these findings stand out to you, Geeta?
I think this case study could be useful to us to review, as support to smallholder farmers is a common strategy and approach in environment programming that really has a clear private sector engagement link.
Great, thank you. Thanks for sharing that example with us of how you're using the evidence gap map for your work with USAID. The scope of the activity that you described with the Latin America and Caribbean Bureau is quite specific to learning related to private sector engagement. How might you use this tool in other work?
Sorry, Kathy, I think I might be having some internet problems, but
I think you froze for a second.
I think
Should I repeat the question?
You were asking about how this tool might be useful in other work.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so our interest was definitely very specific, but I think as other implementing partners are planning or designing their work in any sector and how they might want to engage the private sector to achieve development objectives, this tool could be a really great resource. Before my time with Measuring Impact 2, I managed a biodiversity activity in Uganda, and we were trying to partner with oil companies to promote more environment-friendly practices. And this was a totally new partnership for us, and it would have been great to have this tool at the time to see who else had done this type of work and what we could have learned from their experiences. And I think as many of USAID and partners know, engaging with the private sector certainly isn't new, and so it's great to have the space to bring all of this valuable information together.
Since you've been working with this tool a bit, is there anything you would suggest to other implementers who may be seeing this for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, I think this evidence gap map is a great resource for any implementer that works with USAID. I could see partners using this tool to inform proposals, new designs, their work plans, their monitoring, evaluation, and learning plans. And I'm sure there's a lot of information that partners already have to help fill the existing gaps in evidence, and could certainly use the gaps in the evidence gap map to inform their own learning and monitoring plans to contribute to overall learning about private sector engagement in the development community.
Yes, absolutely. For everyone joining us today, please use the form at the bottom of the page to submit anything we may have missed and to continue to share your work as it is completed. Thank you, Gita, for sharing your insights on the use of the PSC evidence gap map from an implementing partner's perspective.
Thanks, Kathy.
So we focused quite a bit on showing you what the evidence gap map includes as evidence. As an evidence gap map, let's tell you more about what we mean in terms of the gaps. Next slide, Paul. So the gap in the title is referring to understanding where there is evidence in the matrix and where there are holes in our knowledge base and understanding. As users like you interact with the evidence gap map and the filters, you will be able to visually see where there is knowledge and where additional investments in research and evaluation might be warranted to further build the evidence base. The private sector engagement team at USAID will be targeting our research efforts to fill these gaps, and we hope you will too. This is also an opportunity to work with us and alert us to any evidence we may have missed using the form that I just mentioned. Next slide. So what's next for this evidence gap map? As we mentioned, it's a living repository, and the PSC evidence gap map will be regularly updated. This means that we are regularly adding new resources and incorporating any user feedback. As implementers who are often doing the work in the field on the ground, we know that there is knowledge that may be on your shelves and in your files that may not be here. So please contribute using the form. We fully recognize that while putting all the evidence in one visualization may be useful, it will still take effort to find the key pieces that are applicable for you. To help further digest this information, we're actually going to be planning to prepare some accompanying syntheses documents. These will zoom in on particular areas of the map, such as an analysis of where there is a lot of evidence or a review of key gaps and how they might be filled. We may also conduct targeted analyses of specific areas of interest, such as a specific sector, a specific industry, a specific private sector value proposition, or a specific geography. Lastly, one of the purposes of this tool was to identify where knowledge gaps remain to better inform research. We hope that implementing partners can use this to better inform their monitoring, evaluation, and learning plans, especially in narrowing your learning questions in your work. And with that, I will open it to any questions from our participants.
Okay, so we have questions that have been submitted through the Q&A function, and we'll begin diving into those. We also had some questions that were submitted beforehand. So we'll start, we may not be able to get to all of them, and I apologize for that, but we will start addressing some of the questions that have been submitted. So one of the questions that was submitted beforehand was, can you describe the types of documents that are included as evidence in this tool? So as you saw in the discussion, we have included a number of different types of documents, and they are actually listed as filters. And so you may be wondering how we came up with this list. We had some pretty in-depth planning meetings alongside our USAID colleagues. And we discussed what types of information would be useful not only for researchers, but also for practitioners, for implementing partners, for mission staff who are developing strategies. And so we deliberately expanded the types of documents that we included in the evidence gap map as a way to enable the use of different types of information. And so those are listed here, and these are the tags that we assigned to the different documents. And it ranges from case study, which might be lower on the evidence scale, to something like a peer-reviewed article, which is something that we found in the literature, or systematic review or meta-analysis, which might be at the higher end of evidence. And so as you use this, you can be mindful that there's a range of evidence strength within the evidence gap map here, as represented by the different types of documents. But we expanded our net to enable you to have different document types that might be useful as you're trying to plan your programs. Next question. What if I'm working on something now that might fill a gap, but is not complete to submit as an evidence piece? That's a good question. And the preference would be, because of the amount of work that goes into coding these documents, would be to wait until your information is complete to submit as an evidence piece to use within the evidence gap map. And that will enable us to ensure that we don't have a corpus of information that is incomplete. So once you have finalized your work, please consider submitting that to the evidence gap map. This next question is for you, Kathy. How will you promote the use of evidence and the collection of evidence in private sector engagement at USAID?
Thanks for that question. So as I mentioned near the start of this webinar, building and acting on evidence of what works and what doesn't in private sector engagement is an operational principle of the agency. Within the private sector engagement team in Washington, we actually have a dedicated work stream to evidence and learning. And our role is in not only generating evidence or working on tools like the evidence gap map, but trying to ensure that there's mission-to-mission sharing and tight feedback loops between pieces of evidence and the users, which is the people in the field, including our mission colleagues and implementers who are using the work on the ground. What we want to do is to ensure that that information is being captured from the field in a timely manner and then being shared back to others who may be able to use it.
Thank you, Kathy. Next, we have a question from Terrence Fitzgerald and also a related question from Cindy Sisek. Thank you all for submitting this. Which data sets did you search for evidence, and what quality criteria did you apply for inclusion in the evidence map? Thank you for the question. The entry point for this work at the beginning was the USAID Development Exchange Clearinghouse. We were able to identify the different projects that were that USAID had indicated were private sector engagement projects that had some component involving the private sector. We used those project numbers to search the Development Exchange Clearinghouse, and we through that process identified a large number of documents, not all of which were relevant. How do we decide whether or not to include them? We had a process whereby we looked at the information that was in there and identified whether or not there was actual evidence that was listed. So we did, when we went through that process, we had something like 2,000 or 3,000 documents, but a lot of them were documents such as just not agreements per se, but a financial report, something that wasn't necessarily inclusive of actual findings or an assessment of the work. And so through this rubric, we were able to distill and filter out those documents that didn't actually include relevance. In terms of quality criteria for inclusion in the evidence map, one of the things that we're looking at is in subsequent iterations of this evidence gap map is how to then assign some kind of a utility rating to the documents. And so that's something that we're in discussions with USAID and with our IT team about how to do that, so that you will be able to see how used the resource is, for instance, and that's what we're looking at right now. As far as quality criteria, we used the evidence, the types of documents, and we didn't apply necessarily a rigor here. And so we left that open to some extent to the users to determine what is useful for them and what is something that actually applies to their situation. Okay, next question here. This is for you, Kathy. Would you tell us more on how USAID would encourage or mandate implementing partners to use this tool? Can other donors use it? It will be very useful if it collects the most data from all development actors.
Thanks, Paul. Certainly other donors can use it and other development actors can use it. It is a publicly available tool and will continue to be updated. In terms of how USAID will encourage our implementing partners to use the tool, USAID has a agency-wide evidence and learning agenda that I described, the Self-Reliance learning agenda, of which one primary question is on private sector engagement. And one of the operational principles of the private sector engagement policy is to build and act on the evidence of what works and what does not in private sector engagement. To that end, we're working with our missions to ensure that they're capturing data on not only their programs, but also the research related to private sector engagement and applying that. We hope that by making this a more complete tool, it actually becomes very useful for implementing partners, and that implementing partners can use it throughout the program cycle in partnership with USAID. So from responding to a proposal request in collaboration with USAID, co-creation designs, and an implementation and monitoring evaluation. So we hope that the utility of the tool will encourage implementing partners to use it, but it's also a priority of the agency to ensure that we're integrating evidence-informed programming into our work.
Thanks, Kathy. Another question. With respect to evidence strength, document type is a first step, but within document types, evidence strength can vary significantly. Are you familiar with the evidence strength rating methods USAID E3ED has tested for screening evidence strength of evaluations before including only the strongest in evaluation syntheses they develop? Have you considered this step for the syntheses you are planning? Great question. And you are absolutely right that there is variation within the strength of the evidence. And so that's something that we have another round of this buy-in that we have discussed as a potential second step, second cut of this evidence gap map for assigning strength to the ratings. And one of the other things, I didn't finish answering Terrence's question. We've also been looking in the peer-reviewed literature. We did a search. We had some search terms that we used in ProQuest database, which searches across numerous political science, economics, and international global development related journals. So this is something that we are considering as the next cut, and it would be good to talk with whoever submitted this question to get a little bit more insight into the methods that they have used so that we can incorporate those into that next step for the syntheses. So thank you for that question. You're right on track with and very accurate with the utility and use of evidence gap maps. Next question, this is for you, Kathy, and there are two related ones, so I'll ask both of them. How will you populate the private sector value proposition fields in the map? Will it be desk research and incorporation of data from existing partnerships, or will there be a strong data acquisition, a marketing effort to reach out to the private sector and collect this data? And related question, will USAID target new partnerships to fill some of the gaps in the evidence? How will this evidence gap map influence upcoming engagement with the private sector?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, so the value propositions as defined in the evidence gap map are actually pulled from our private sector engagement policy. And they're the key areas where we see that the private sector can add value to development impact. Alongside, we've also identified the value propositions for development actors and where actors like USAID add value when we engage the private sector. So the intersection is actually the way USAID sees us engaging the private sector and the value proposition we hope to gain. In terms of filling out the resources within each of those intersections, our push is definitely widespread. So internal in the agency to collect any existing information, external to partners like you to help fill in the blanks, as well as with our private sector partners that may have resources to contribute as well. In terms of targeting new partnerships or specific private sector engagements to fill the gaps, I think that will be highly dependent on our mission colleagues and the specific development objectives that they're trying to achieve. When we engage the private sector, we want to ensure that it is to the end of the development outcome and that the private sector value that's being added helps us improve that development result. But I wouldn't say that we would necessarily target a specific partnership or engagement where there's an evidence gap, but we would target specific research or learning efforts where those engagements might exist and there may be little evidence.
Thank you, Kathy. Next question is, did you also include documents that are not written in English in your mapping process? Unfortunately not. That would have required an extensive addition of resources in order to make that happen. And while we are not close to the idea, in order for us to tag the documents, we have to actually read them. We have to read them, digest them, understand what is going on. And so in order to include documents that are not in English, we would need to have members of the team who would speak what the given language, and we would need to decide which languages to start with. So that's a conversation to be had, but it's something that was not within our ability to accomplish within the scope of this first cut. Kathy, will USAID be developing a complementary diagnostic to help practitioners identify relevant tools and approaches that may be most applicable to their program goals and objectives?
Thank you for that question. So I wouldn't say that we are developing a complementary diagnostic, but we are working on a number of pieces that will help people use the tool. So Paul, who's here, is working on sort of a user guide for different users and provides instructions on how to actually navigate the evidence gap map. So for people who didn't attend the webinar today, they would be able to walk through the tool and find the resources that are most valuable to them. In addition, because we know that there's a lot of information in this visualization, it still might be difficult to find the resources that are most useful for you. We're also working with the Pulte Institute and Paul's team on a number of synthesis documents. So based on what seem to be prevalent needs within the agency, we will be targeting syntheses of either specific cross-sections within the evidence gap map or other areas of interest where there might be either a lot of evidence or not as much evidence. So that might target a specific industry, it might target a specific technical sector or a specific geography. And that's all going to be a part of this next phase of the evidence gap maps work.
Thank you, Kathy. The next question is, how long did it take to build this evidence gap map? How big was the team working to develop this? Thank you for the question. And the short answer is we are still building it. We see this as a living document. But to really answer your question, this was something that took multiple phases. And the first phase was really to stabilize the actual matrix that you see here, the rows and the columns. And in order to do that, we were really in the process of discussing with USAID, co-creation process, and the stabilization of the private sector policy and the evidence and learning strategy really helped us to finalize this. The next step was to really identify what metadata we needed to tag within each document. And so that was a process of trial and error, of going back and forth and identifying what we wanted each document to entail in terms of capturing information about that document. So that took a couple of months of back and forth in order to do that. Finally, identifying the documents within the Development Exchange Clearinghouse. That took a couple of months to filter through those, another couple of months. And I had a team between 6 and 8 students and staff working on this, usually over the summer. And so it took about a year from beginning to end to really get to a stable product. But as I say, we're actually looking to the next step of this, the next phases of some of the things we've already mentioned. And so we see this as an open piece of work. Next question. What are assumptions built into the evidence presented and its proposed use? So we tried to minimize the assumptions to the extent possible. We are mindful that we cannot predict every use for this tool, and we cannot predict every single user for this tool. And so we wanted to enable the users to have the flexibility to use it in the way that they see fit, that would support their work in order to engage the evidence. So the assumptions that we built into the evidence presented are the metadata that we tagged, and not much more beyond that. Now, we will do a synthesis report, and that will have certain assumptions built in, and we will need to look at the strength of the evidence for that, in reference to the previous question about the evidence strength. But the evidence gap map itself was really a process of tagging and trying to extract information in as flexible a way as possible for this first phase. Can the private sector engagement evidence gap map be a useful tool in war zone, armed conflict, and politically unstable regions? So that is a great question. And I think the answer to that lies in the way that you filter the corpus. So it might be that you look at specific countries that might be in that type of a situation. It might be that you use a search function here with the title and key findings. We also had, let me pull up a piece of evidence. We had special considerations here, tags, and one of them has to do with conflict. And so we did tag some of those, although we did not include that as a filter. So you may be able to search for conflict within the evidence gap map. But if this is something that is in high demand, this particular question, we can put our heads together with USAID and think about ways we might use or assign a filter to the evidence gap map for conflict situations. So thank you for that question. That's a great question. And I think that does it for our questions. Kathy, is there anything else you wanted to add or highlight in terms of the questions that we received?
No, just wanted to thank you and your team for creating this useful tool and for hosting this webinar.
Great. So we do have a poll. So before you drop off the call, please fill out the poll with some of the questions that we have. And I will add another plea to allow us to tap into your knowledge and your expertise by submitting resources to the evidence gap map that we will then code and add to this corpus of knowledge. Please submit your evidence to us so that we can really build this tool out to reflect the totality of the knowledge that's out there. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate your participation. We are open for questions if you have additional questions that you'd like to ask, and we look forward to seeing the evidence that you will submit to us. Thank you, everyone, and this will end the webinar today.